That was Joseph Smith. He says, yeah, you can read about Moses, but I talk to Moses. What made Joseph Smith so radical is that he made the gospel so literal. His view of Zion was very much not just, oh, it's in my heart. It's we're building something real. Every single one of us are going to understand Joseph Smith to the degree that we walk in his steps.
Excited about this interview with Hannah Stoddard. I love speaking with Hannah. She's very passionate about what she does. She knows Joseph Smith very, very well. And so I love the conversations that we have. Maybe some things you've never heard of. We're going to go over in this discussion here. By the way, make sure that you have subscribed, push the little bell down there so that you get the notifications. Also, this January 27th, that's 2025, in St. George, actually Hurricane, we're going to have a barbecue dinner and a presentation on Teddy Bear Jesus and Exaltation by yours truly. That's the 27th. You can go to CwicMedia.com, look for that event. I'll also have the link in the description box. If you're in the Vegas or Southern Utah area, be sure to be there. Would love to see you there. This episode is brought to you by Go and Do Travel. I just came off of the Momentum cruise on the West Coast. Hundreds of Latter-day Saints, unbelievable entertainment, great presentations. I'm heading to the East Coast Momentum here. More of the same, hundreds of Latter-day Saints, great entertainment, edifying messages. And so being this excited about it and energized about it, I want to tell you about Momentum 26. This is already starting to sell. This is January 3rd to January 10th. Next year on the West Coast, you've got Puerto Vallarta, Mazatlan, Cabo San Lucas, San Diego. Entertainment like Nathan Pacheco, David Osmond, Jenny Oaks Baker, and speakers like Elaine Dalton and Anthony Sweat, the Temple guy. Love his stuff. This is not church for a week. This is a whole different experience. Go to QuicMedia.com, go up to trips and events, and go down to Momentum to find out more and to register. Here we go. Welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. In this episode, we've brought back Hannah Stoddard from the Joseph Smith Foundation. Hannah, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Greg. Always fun to be with you.
I'm excited about this discussion here. We're going to talk about the prophet Joseph Smith. I feel that as I've studied him, I've gotten to know him a little bit. He's my favorite prophet, obviously, but there's a lot that I don't know. And I want, hopefully, for you to cover some things about his teachings.
Yeah.
We read the Doctrine and Covenants, so we've got a lot of it there, but I don't think we get much beyond that usually.
Yeah,
and so hopefully
I think we miss a little bit of his personality, just kind of.
Okay, so I want to hear about that.
Yeah.
So fill in the gaps a little bit, starting off here on his personality, from his history and from his teachings.
Okay. I might just go back a little bit, like with my story kind of on this a little bit, because I joke with my sister about this all the time, because she was the kid that even at 15 and 16, during like a more rebellious period of her life, she would be in there reading Words of Joseph Smith, which is Joseph Smith's Nauvoo sermons by Andrew E. Hatt put together. Okay. She'd just be like, these are amazing. I love these. And for some reason, I had a little bit of a disconnect, which a lot of people probably wouldn't guess, because they're like, but you're Hannah Stoddard, like you've done all these books, the Joseph Smith Foundation. And I think that's something that God has kind of let me do a lot in my life. Like, it hasn't always come naturally. Some things, like even some doctrinal things, I have to put in effort to appreciate it. And Joseph Smith's teachings was definitely one of those. And so it's actually been in the last probably 4 or 5 years actually saying, okay, I want to figure out what the big hype is with, like, obviously, because I grew up with my dad and even my sister, and they're like, these are just like, you got to just like eat it, like eat them all up. Like, they're amazing. Like, okay, I want to figure out what the big, And I want to be like transparent about that, because some people may be like, oh, can you say that? Like, oh, like, what's the big deal about like Joseph Smith's teachings? Like, why would we really care? Beyond the duh answers, I've always been like, okay, beyond the duh answer, I want to know actually what's the substance here. And so I started getting into Joseph Smith's teachings, and it was just like a whole new world opened up for me. And I think the Lord was helping me see, like, whoa, okay, there's so much packed in here. And so that's when you called me, and I was like, well, what do you want to talk about with Joseph Smith? I'm like, we can go a million different directions here. And you're like, I want to do the teachings. I'm like, okay, cool, let's do this. So.
Yeah, so with the teachings, I remember going back, and I think that was one of the few books that was approved on my mission. the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith. Is that Joseph Fielding Smith?
Fielding Smith.
Yeah, that put that together. So I remember reading through it, and a lot of it is, it's like, okay, I read some things. There were some things about like, how do you treat animals, and a number of different things. It's just like it's compiled, right? It's everything they could pull together. I think that they had that they were compiled together. Yeah. But again, where do you see, as you look through these teachings, do you see themes? Do these fall under some kind of a truth hierarchy, or so to speak? I am always interested. What I always look at with Joseph Smith is I look at the JST, because the reason I do that is because I want to see the difference, right? I want to see the difference from what was there, what Christianity had, what Judaism had, and now what is Joseph Smith bringing to the table, and in some cases changing.
Yes.
And as I see it, where he focuses the most on the changes seems to be with Abraham, creation, and with the restoration of the priesthood under something that we would call an Abrahamic covenant and exaltation.
Yeah, I was going to just the new and everlasting covenant. Like, keep going. Sorry. Yeah.
No, that's so. With that, do you see the same thing then? I mean, you see something that is built under this new and everlasting covenant, and how does he get there? Do you have an idea of where he gets this? How early on? Because there's these little seeds that you start seeing from Moroni even early on that start to lay this little foundation for him. But I don't know where his light kind of turns on.
Yes. Okay. Well, I love that you're heading this direction, because as you're talking, I'm like, oh, this is so interesting. This is kind of the journey I went on too. So I'm wondering, I wonder if there is more of a theme there too. Definitely with the Joseph Smith translation, that's what stuck out to me. So a couple of years ago, I was like, my dad had an experience on his mission where he just really felt like Joseph Smith translation, and he hadn't really thought much about it up to that point. A ton, like he'd read it and studied it, and but it kind of got his attention. And then I was thinking about that experience a couple of years ago, and it was kind of just, one of those questions that sit in the back of your mind and you can't let it go. And so I was like, okay, I've got to figure out what is it about this Joseph Smith translation. And when I was going through it, I had the same epiphany. I was like, okay, this is all the covenants got pulled out, which is what Nephi says, right, in the Book of Mormon. He's like, they go through the great and abominable church, they pull out the covenants. And you're exactly right. That's the first thing Moroni brings up to Joseph Smith. So, and interrupt me at any time, because I can start going and going.
Roll.
So yeah, right there, Joseph Smith shows up to Moroni. We don't know a ton of what happened in the first vision. I personally feel like the first vision probably went hours long. Joseph Smith says he doesn't share most of what happened there. So, and all of Don Bradley's research about that probably being like an endowment and everything like that. I think that's fascinating. I think there's a lot of merit to that. But for actually what we know, Moroni shows up to Joseph Smith, right? He's 16, 17 years old. Okay. My mind's blanking on his age, but he's a teenager, right? And Moroni comes and he quotes Malachi about we need to turn the hearts of the children to the fathers. Well, Joseph Smith gives a sermon in Nauvoo later on where he says that word turn should actually better be translated seal. And he goes on and starts talking about the seal of Elijah. So that is probably one of the first topics that got my attention, actually kind of getting into Joseph Smith's teachings, because we were working on a project where we were trying to organize all of Joseph Smith's teachings by topic. And we've started putting that on our website. We are not completed yet, but it's a work in progress. And my sister had just finished the topping on calling and election. So all the quotes on having your calling and election made sure. So she's like, okay, Hannah, can you check these off before we post them on the website? And I was reading those, and I remembered that when I was 12, I went to a private school. My dad taught at that private school, so we would commute together every day. And he had teachings of Joseph Smith, among other things. Like sometimes it was Jane Eyre, sometimes Jane Austen. It was teachings of Joseph Smith one day. And I remember there was the quote from Joseph Smith talking about having your calling and election made sure. And he was like, pray, don't cease till you obtain it. And I just remember thinking I have not a clue what he is talking about. And so that came back to me a couple of years ago when we were doing this calling and election. And so we're reading all of these quotes. And what I started realizing really quick about Joseph Smith is he's very practical. So when you ask that question about, what are these themes?
What do you mean practical?
very real life. So like you're saying, treatment of animals. He'll start talking about education, military, political principles, but in such a simple, common sense, real life way. He's not someone that just starts talking philosophically, where it's intangible and it's very, very real life. And I think a lot of that came from his experiences with visions. He's building cities. He's setting up towns. His view of Zion was very much not just, oh, it's in my heart. It's we're building something real, So everything was centered around that. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's important to get into Joseph Smith's teachings, because I was thinking about that this morning. So many of these topics, like I just brought up the calling and election. Okay, so there's a lot of people that start going down that road, and they get really weird, really fast, and start having psycho experiences to the point that it gets like this, like personally for me, it's like the minute you hear someone talking about it, you're like, okay, are you in the nutcase group or are you like somewhat sane? And I think a lot of that comes because we just start going on these wild hares instead of getting grounded in the actual doctrine, getting grounded in the teachings. Because if you study Joseph Smith, like he talks about who the 144,000 are. He talks about how living your calling election, and it's very non-sensationalistic, common sense, logical. Like I just brought up the 144,000. Well, Joseph Smith is really simple. He's like, it's men in the last days who obtain the priesthood ordinances, and they go out there and they basically kill themselves serving other people and achieve what every single one of us have the opportunity to achieve in the temple. It's really simple. It's not weird. It's not creepy. It's not mysterious. It's not hush hush. It's actually really simple. It's like, okay, just go obey the common doctrines that are everywhere to be found. This is no secret, and so that's what I love about Joseph Smith, even having a calling election maturity. He's like, it's really simple. God tests you. He's gonna I was gonna say something that's more casual, but I should probably watch my language. But he's basically Satan, not Satan. The Lord is gonna just test you to the point to where he knows you are not gonna back out. And then he's like, okay, I can trust you with responsibility. Like pretty simple. So anyway, I'm going off on a lot of different subjects, but those are just a few.
Just a little tangent on that. One thing I've come to believe is that you talk about responsibility. I think that's really interesting. Is when you go through the history. This is a little off topic here, but when you go through the history of the scriptures, you look at like Israel at Sinai.
Yeah.
And really, what I would say is probably the early saints' experience. It's so much about responsibility, right? The Israelites at Sinai refused the responsibility, basically, of the higher covenants. And, at Sinai, we get this, I call it a sleight of hand because of the golden calf and the partying when Moses comes back down the first time, But the problem wasn't just that.
Yeah.
Right? They said no.
Yes.
To seeing the face of God, to essentially going up with Moses to Sinai, to the top of Sinai. And instead, and that's my little metaphor, is they brought God down to them instead. But it's all about responsibility. And I feel like exaltation.
Yeah.
It's for the people that were going to sacrifice and work and stretch themselves and take on responsibility. It seems like that is such a central part of what Joseph Smith taught.
Yes. Yes. I love that you're bringing that up because, even that whole experience where Moses is like, come and see the face of God. So that's a whole topic. Again, we're talking about when people get off into the wild hares and they're like, oh, I want to have like my second comforter and I want to talk to Jesus. They're missing the whole point. And that's why I think a lot of them get deceived. Where, they're having experiences, but I'm going to say most of them are not legit. And I'll stand by that. Just look at the fruits. Because, and this is something, again, if we were actually rooted in reading Joseph Smith's teachings and understanding the point, we would see, well, what's the whole point of talking to God? Why did Moses want the children of Israel to go talk to God? Is it because, you can be special and you're part of this special group and we're going to go talk to Jesus? Like, no, it's because the whole... Let's just step back for a second. So what's the whole purpose of life, right? Well, second Nephi, it's joy, it's happiness. And I think if we actually think about it, every single person knows that. Every single thing we do every day is calculated towards what we think is going to help us be happy, either short-term, long-term. Like, why am I sitting here in this like studio having this conversation when I could be doing something else? It's because I think in the long run, this conversation is actually going to make me happy, you happy, like we're all going to be happier, right? And so there was a man, God the Father, who figured out how to actually be happy the right way. And so he sets up this plan. He's like, hey, let's do this, and sends us to earth, and now here we are in mortality. But Joseph Smith has a quote where he says, you can only get knowledge through experience. He says, reading everything ever written on a subject isn't going to do it for you. You've got to actually experience this. And I think all of us can recognize that it's one thing to read about having a loved one die of cancer. It's one thing to read about going through depression. It's a whole nother game when you've actually gone through it. You gain experience, right? And that was Joseph Smith. He says, yeah, you can read about Moses, but I talk to Moses. And guess what? I know a lot more about Moses than you do. You can read all day and night everything every scholar's written on Moses, or I can spend 5 minutes talking to him and I can tell you his personality, what he's like, what this really looks like. I can read all about the creation, or I can see the creation. I can read about Enoch, or I can actually see the city of Enoch in vision, and that's what made Joseph Smith so great. Is he talked to all these people. He talked to Paul. He had experience, and his goal was he wanted every single one of us to say, hey, if you really want to understand how to be happy, if you want to really get this, you've got to experience. So when Moses is sitting there with the children of Israel and he's like, come talk to God, it's because he's saying, I want you to actually become like this guy. And to do that, you've got to know who he really is. And you can't just sit in your little corner reading what someone else wrote about him.
You have to kind of become like him a little bit.
Yeah.
Or at least make the decision you're going to do that.
Yeah. Yes.
To close the gap to some degree, right?
Yeah. If he says you need to be a good father, well, you got to know what a good father looks like. What does he talk like? How does he act? And to be able to do that, there's a certain level where you can only see so much from our culture. We're all pretty messed up from our culture, right?
Yes.
You've got to transcend the culture, and to do that comes through coming to know God, and that's the whole point. And so I think that's where Joseph Smith, his whole goal was, he was saying, okay, I've done this. I've actually talked to these prophets. I actually see the plan. I see what Zion is supposed to look like, and I want you guys to too. Let me help you. And that's why I think it was Brigham Young who said Joseph Smith could just take the most complicated subjects, complicated theology that everybody was debating about, and he could just explain it in 5 seconds so simply. Well, how did he gain that knowledge?
Yeah.
Experience.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because if you go to, this is something that I have a discussion with sometimes with, it might be an atheist or other members of the church that are talking about science, right? And it's like, okay, science is great. It's a way to find truth, right? But there's also a spiritual science that works exactly the same way as I see it. And in fact, Alma uses the term experiment. And if you follow the principles that he goes through, it is the scientific method. Yeah, it's the scientific method. It's the same exact thing. The difference is that it's not knowledge through eyesight and observation. It's a knowledge through experience, as you said.
Yeah.
So it goes through the same thing. In fact, I was just having this discussion with someone online trying to go through this. And in fact, if you read empirical evidence and what the definition is, it says observation or experience. It is empirical evidence, right? It's just that it's intimate.
Yes.
Right? It's just for you. And that's kind of what, it seems like Joseph Smith, I don't know when this would have started, maybe it's the first vision, but he always had this desire, almost, it seems to me like something that almost was, I don't know if overwhelming is the right word, but just driving him to have everybody else have a similar experience, like the same thing.
I agree, 100%. Because he knew how to he kind of paved the way, and he's like, okay, every single one of you guys can get there too.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. So what are some other teachings from Joseph Smith that maybe we might cover here that people may not be aware of?
Yeah. Okay, that's a great question. Well, I wanted to throw in a plug for this. You mentioned The Teachings of Joseph Smith by Joseph Fielding Smith. This is one of my favorite books. It's Encyclopedia of Joseph Smith's Teachings. My grandma bought this for me a couple of years ago, and I was like, how did I not know this existed? He has a lot of Joseph Smith's teachings by topic, not everything. That's where the Joseph Smith papers are coming in handy, and that's why eventually, I would love to. We're trying so hard in our spare moments to do this project, just try to get everything categorized online. But you can go any topic, charity, darkness, what hell is. And that's, again, where Joseph Smith just starts debunking all of these rumors, theology, ideas that we came from the great apostasy. What is hell? How are you saved? And he just starts explaining, and you're like, okay, that's the most common sense thing in the world. Why didn't I get that? Example, since I just mentioned the thing about hell, he explains, he's like, hell is just the torment of your disappointed hopes. You get to the other side and you realize you didn't achieve what you could have achieved. It was there, and you made choices and exercised your agency in a way, and you're like, oh, shoot, that was stupid. That's what eats at you. God is not this person with a stick trying to beat you up. He's constantly like, I want you here. I am not going to cut you off from anything. So it explains your hell is literally just what you build for yourself. So don't be stupid. Don't do it. And at the same time, the Lord's right there, the minute you're willing to change it, so it's just, okay, that makes so much more sense than all these other questions of and how long are we going to suffer? And he's like, it's kind of in your hands. How long do you want to suffer? How long do you want to just hold on in stubbornness? No, my way, I threw a couple quotes this morning when I was because I was thinking that same idea. What are some specifics? The parable of the prodigal son. Okay, this is one of my favorites. I'm not sure if you've already read Joseph Smith's interpretation.
I don't think so.
Okay, it's so interesting. So he sits down and it's in a sermon, and I think it's in Nauvoo, and he says everyone's debating on what the meaning of the parable of the prodigal son. He was like, it's really simple, and he was like, and everyone asked me, how do you interpret parables? And he was like, you don't interpret them, you just ask what's the question that was asked, why Jesus gave the parable. He's like, that will tell you the answer. So what was the question? Well, the Pharisees are coming in, they're like, why are you eating with all these publicans and sinners? Why are you hanging out with them? So he gives the parable of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and then the parable of the prodigal son. They're all answering that question. So he says the parable of the lost sheep. And he explains that the 99 were the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So the 99 are the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the one lost sheep is the prostitute, the sinner, the publican that is humble and wants to repent. In other words, all 100 sheep were lost. It's not there's 99 that are pure. No, those Pharisees and those Sadducees were pretty corrupt, a lot of them too, right? But he's like, all of you are so, and Joseph Smith says this, let me see if I had the exact quote, but he basically says, they're so righteous, they're going to be damned anyway. Meaning they think they're so righteous, but they're really lost too. Well, that completely changes the whole meaning of the parable. All 100 sheep are lost, but only one of them realizes they're lost and actually is willing to be found. Same with the prodigal son. He's like, the older son is the Pharisees and the Sadducees, saying we've always done the right thing. He's like, really? You mostly just have built up this fake righteousness. You're actually not following me. And here's this prodigal son who is willing to change, and he expects nothing. He's like, I'm just willing to be a servant. I don't even have to be a son. And the father's like, oh, okay, you're someone I can work with. It's actually humble. And when the father says to his older son, everything I have is yours. You're always with me. Why do you care? He's being sarcastic. He's saying, you already say you've got everything. You've got the temple. You've got everything. You've got life figured out. He's like, why do you even need me? You don't need me, So you can start, if you now go back to the New Testament, you start seeing, okay, there's a little humor in here, a little sarcasm that Jesus Christ is throwing in there, and Joseph Smith picks up on that. Anyway, that one has been really maybe just transformative for me personally, because I've seen that play out so many times in my life, and starting to recognize what God really cares about, people with pasts, with baggage. Okay, people, all of us, right? But at different levels, what God really cares about, who he's actually searching for, what our attitude should be, how do you judge righteously, how do you not judge falsely, and all of that. But anyway, those are just two fun ones right there.
Do you think, what about, obviously we're going to look at things that are canonized as the top, right?
Yeah.
That's we're going to go up here with the writings.
Yeah.
But how do you view the teachings of Joseph Smith outside of the D&C, for example?
Okay, this is a great
Where
question.
is this, and why don't we use it more?
Okay, this is a great question. So when you are going through Joseph Smith's teachings, you have to realize Joseph Smith didn't write down very much himself, where he's sitting at a paper just writing himself. It either comes through scribes or someone writing down his sermon as he's talking, right? Now, this is used by some people, like all of the polygamy deniers and stuff like that, where they're like, basically they use it as a justification, basically eliminate 99% of the record of Joseph Smith's teachings that we have, which always makes me laugh because I'm like, you guys claim to love Joseph Smith so much, but 99% of his words that have been handed to us, you throw out. That's very convenient for you. Anyway, so I think with each of Joseph Smith's teachings, same with any historical document, look at who it came from. Compare it. So a lot of times Joseph Smith is giving a sermon and we've got multiple people reporting the same sermon. So you can compare and contrast, see the parts that are the same. Sometimes they clarify each other. Sometimes there's statements that come decades and decades and decades later, but they match with things that are more contemporary, or they match with things in the scriptures. And then there's sometimes statements where people say 50 years later, oh, I heard Joseph Smith say this. And you're like, well, that kind of contradicts what's in the scriptures. So you got to be careful with those. I'll use a few examples would be like the White Horse Prophecy, some of the statements on the lost tribes. Joseph Fielding McConkie has a really good article called The Scriptural Search for the Lost Tribes of Israel, I think is what it's called. And he walks through, okay, what do we actually know for sure what Joseph Smith said? What's a little bit more hearsay? So there is a little bit of ranking where you got to be a little bit careful with some of those things. But a lot of for example, what we have in the Joseph Smith papers, it's right there at the time. You have Willard Richards or Howard Corey or others just sitting right there. And as Joseph Smith's talking, they're taking the notes and they are so rich and they're filled with things.
But at the same time, I guess you do have to have a little bit of they're secondhand.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a little bit of well, is this exactly what he said? Exactly. Because if you go through scripture, even then it's very difficult to, what is the verse in 2nd Nephi talking about, after all we can do, right? Then you're saved after all we can do. And if you have to really look at it to understand what's being said there. So if you got a secondhand account, it's like, okay, I can get the gist maybe of everything, but you're
going to need the Spirit.
Yeah.
Just like with everything. And without the Spirit, you're going to get lost. I mean, that's why we've got thousands of years of people fighting in Christendom over things that should be so simple.
Yeah.
You know, debating about Paul, like twisting every kind of word in the book, you know. But at the same time, we do have a lot of Joseph Smith's teachings that are very clear. They're recorded pretty well. There's actually a lot more than people realize. There was a lot more than I realized. And again, they just make complete sense. There's some that Joseph Smith writes completely himself, like his editorial Try the Spirits that was published in the Times and Seasoned. That's one of my favorites.
I don't even know what that is.
Okay. This is one of the first things I read of Joseph Smith's teachings when I was like, okay, I'm going to get serious. Like, okay, Lord, like I have been playing games too long. I'm going to put my money where my mouth is and I'm going to like do the work to study these out. And I got led to this editorial Joseph Smith wrote on discernment. The whole thing. He explains laws about how to discern, how to tell spiritual experiences, what's true, what the Spirit of God feels like versus false counterfeits. And it was really interesting because I had read it before, but most of it I think kind of went over my head. And now reading it a few years later with a little bit more experience under my belt, maybe a little more of a humble heart, and the Spirit just started opening my mind like, oh my word, it is packed. And it was so fascinating. I kid you not, like over the next 6 months after I read it, I encountered so many friends that were in having false spiritual experiences. And it was so good to be like, okay, does it check out with all of these things? Like, here's this teaching. And
is this similar to the handshaking with the spirits?
He does a little bit more of impressions. So how to tell when an insight or an idea you have is orderly. He talks about an accusing spirit with like accusing leaders. He goes through like even specific members who had come to him and said, oh, an angel came to me like this and that. And he was like, well, that's debunked because of the scripture here. Or he talks about women having revelations, like men having revelations, leaders, like is there a difference between men and women having revelations? He does go into that a little bit, especially with how it should be taken from the church, like how much stock should be placed in it. But you have to be careful with, that's like opening a whole can of worms right there. Sounds like it. Because at the same time, I mean, if we want to talk about the role of women, that's a whole like untapped resource of Joseph Smith's teaching, really, and spiritual gifts, and I think we've totally lost the whole role of women. And I'm not a feminist. I'm not saying that in the sense of no one twist that to say I'm out there like promoting ordained women, but like we're good in the church. We're good. But what I mean is maybe as members, we do not, as women, we are not embracing our potential. We are not realizing the untapped power we could be accessing and using and what we should be doing to build the kingdom of God. We just don't realize the power that you have already. Yeah. Do I go down this path? I'm beginning a nod from the producer. Okay. So there's something I've been focusing on a lot more recently, and that is there's a lot of data on women and religion and faith that's coming out right now. It's changing really fast. And it's, as an example, women are still more religious than men, but not with Gen Z. It's the same. Right? The nuns are the same, male and female. And if you read Isaiah and you go through what Isaiah talks about and what is going to happen in the last days, it does talk about some things about men. But then when it gets down to things, it's to the women. It's like they're the last stronghold and they falter. Yes. And it's like, that's scary. I mean, even as a man, I'm thinking to myself, my wife is like an anchor to me. I have to rely on that sometimes because sometimes I will act not as purely in this is what God wants. I'll do it because of my responsibility to my wife and my kids, right? It's like that's an extra anchor for me. So if I've lost that too, that is really scary. Yeah. Well, kind of my journey on the whole women thing, again, it goes back to Joseph Smith's teaching. So this is 2022, and I just finished the Try the Spirit study, and it was, the Lord is very practical. I feel like when we put in the effort to study, he uses it immediately. Like he'll lead us like, okay, go study this. And then you'll start finding people you need to help. And that's what happened for me on the discernment for sure. And then the next month I was reading Joseph Smith's teachings to the Relief Society. So it's his sermons, like when they're setting up the Relief Society and the advice that he gave them. And there's things where he explains, okay, here's your strengths, here's your weaknesses, here's the things to watch out for. And it started sticking out to me, some of the things Joseph Smith talking about, meekness. He talks about always being comforting, having this just very uplifting, cheerful like spirit, and the power that women can have if they'll do that. And the Lord started calling me to repentance as I was reading this. And he was saying, you are not like as meek as you should be. You don't truly. And I remember sitting there where I was like, okay, I have always been against feminism. Like if anything, like I come from a very conservative, like culture. Traditional. Yes. Yeah. Yes. And so I was like, what? And the Lord was like, I'm not into actions. I'm not into clothes. I'm into the heart. And when it comes to the heart, every single one of you guys are about like equal, like everywhere. And you have a lot to change. And so I started kind of the Lord started leading me on this journey of, okay, let's work on your heart. Let's change your nature. Let's become more meek and kind and different things. And interestingly, as I got more into the temple endowment and as I started studying Abraham more, that's what the Lord it seemed like the Lord kept leading me back to Sarah, to Rebecca, to these examples, right? Like as women. And then after I feel like the Lord kind of just really put me through a cleansing process for a while, then I started diving into more of the teachings about, okay, it was almost like the Lord's like, okay, now I can trust you now to teach you about all the things you can do. Like there is a power here. And that's a whole nother topic with women's roles and the priesthood and all of those things. That's like, okay, better not get into that unless we have an hour just for that. But 100%, I almost feel like I'm probably going to move that direction a little bit with my life calling, because I think women need more of an anchor. I think we're getting hit by a lot of voices, and women are searching for their identity. They're searching for something more, and God does not want us to go and recreate the past. A lot of people are like, oh, it's so bad today. Let's go back and recreate Victorian England or, the 50s. Okay, no, all of those time periods are trash. They're all apostate. We need to be progressing forward. And I think a lot of women are hungering for that. And that's why they're sometimes prey to a lot of voices out there of women saying, oh yeah, okay, and inciting kind of this rebellious edge.
Especially like heartstrings, tugging on heartstrings.
Yes. And that's why I do have empathy for women that are even drawn by name specifics, like the Julie Hanks types, or there are others, because I don't necessarily agree, but I see where they're twisting, and I see the need. The women have questions and they have needs. They're just getting the wrong answers. And I think a lot of those answers could go back to, if we better understood, coming back to Joseph Smith's teachings on the kingdom of God, what it looks like in a very practical, real sense, men's roles, women's roles. It's almost like we just need to completely just bulldoze everything down and rebuild, like everything. Just question with boldness, even the existence of God, and say, okay, like, do I really understand? And go in with an open heart. And I think if we do that, and Joseph Smith's teachings are a great place.
Well, and that's what he did. Yeah. I mean, really, I think that he had to go through. How do you come out the other side like he did without going fully into a position of, I call it, and a lot of, Bruce Porter, for example, he'll talk about the wrestling with God of Jacob, and that's a temple experience, and that's actually the ritual embrace, and and then Enos, wrestles with God. I feel like we are supposed to do that.
Yep.
And when I say wrestling, I mean not arguing, but almost. You know what I mean? It's almost.
If you've done it with God, you know what they're talking about.
Yes, exactly. It's like you have to, but wait a minute, and just engage.
Yes.
But I feel that, and I'm certainly guilty of this. I feel like even in prayer, it's like, it's so passive sometimes, and it's not like, how important is this to me?
Yes.
Why, look at Joseph Smith in Liberty Jail. I mean, he's just like stands up. He's sick of it. He's almost yelling at God.
Yeah.
And it's, there's something to that. I don't think
there's a difference.
It's not fully rebellion.
Yes,
right?
It's not. But it's very strong and it's impassioned. Passion isn't bad.
Yes.
The rebellious, stuck-up, snarky attitude, I know personally, doesn't help you out. The pride. But when you can go to God with confidence, say, okay, God, I've done everything you've told me. This is not adding up. What's going on here? And you have that really frank, honest, you're humble, but it's at the same time, you've done your part. And like Joseph Smith says, come boldly to the throne of grace. And I've had experiences in my life like that where I knew I had done everything God asked me to do. And there's opposition coming in like crazy. And you go to God and you're like, okay, God, like I'm not moving here. I'm obeying 100%. I need to know. I need to know more. I had an experience like that probably about a month ago. And I was at the temple and everything. And I was like, okay, God, like I need some pieces. I need you to come through on your part of the deal. And like things opened up about Adam and Eve and just all sorts of things. It was a really powerful experience for me, but it came from a wrestling. Absolutely, it was a wrestle. There's no better way to describe it.
Yeah, I think, you know, that's a little bit more, I think, in the Jewish tradition. They're a little more like that, even with each other.
Yeah.
You know, it's like much more debate.
Well, they care because they realize it matters.
Yeah.
And when your life is on the line or your family's life is on the line or your future's on the line, suddenly you start caring. And I think Joseph Smith saw that. And that's why he cared so much, because he was like, okay, my salvation and the salvation of everyone alive is at stake. And this is where we can get. So they really cared. And I think a lot of us, I mean, that's why we're putting in all these sacrifices to do these research, to do these podcasts. It's because we care, because we see the answers are right there and anyone can access them. You don't have to pay any money for it. You don't have to. It's literally sitting on your bookshelf for free. Yeah. Just pick up those dusty scriptures and start wrestling with God for those answers.
Yeah, and there's also I think maybe sometimes, again, I can go back to, I talk about this a lot, but this politeness in our culture as Latter-day Saints, it's almost like it's also pointed toward God.
Yeah.
It's like, well, I need to be polite. And politeness is a virtue, but it's not a high virtue to me. It's like, it's...
Apathy is almost what we call polite.
Yes.
It's like, I'll just be mellow.
Yeah. And it's like, I don't think that much gets done that way.
Yes.
You know, and it's not a virtue that produces much. It's almost a veil of sorts over our own lack of production or responsibility, going back to responsibility sometimes.
Yes.
You know?
Yes. I think what you're saying, I know exactly what you're saying. And I think it's really important. I think we need to care and we need to invest more. And I think that's what you see with so many of the early brethren, like the Brigham Youngs and the Heber C. Kimballs. And that's why they rub a lot of people wrong.
They're not polite.
They're not polite, but it's because they could see something that the rest of us couldn't. And they had experiences that a lot of us realize aren't completely accessible to any one of us, you know. With that, I just have to emphasize again, because I went down this road both the wrong way and then the right way, the importance of discovering what true meekness and true humility is. And that's something that I would say, don't go to the culture to define what those terms are. Because again, what you're saying, it's nice, it's passive, it's gross, right? And it was last year, I had an experience where I had a dream and I felt like the Lord was like, you need to discover what real meekness really is. And I could feel the Lord telling me, your idea of what it is not what it is. And so I was like, well, that's not really helping me out here. Like, I kind of need some details. If I'm going to do this, I need, some specifics. And that took wrestling and prayer and study for a couple months and God sent me on different experiences and things to teach me better what meekness was. And so now I would say, okay, yeah, that meekness is essential. If you're going to sit down and have that conversation with God, if you want to get an answer, you've got to be meek and you've got to be humble and you've got to be reverent, but not reverent in the way the world defines it. It's trying to put something intangible into words. But and I think if you just seek God and ask him, he helps you. He helps you understand. But yes, be more bold.
There's a book that I love. It's one of my favorite books. It's from Stephen Ricks and LeGrand Baker, and it's called Who Shall Ascend the Hill of the Lord, whatever the verse is. I think it's in it's Psalm 24. And it's all about the Psalms, which are a temple drama, right? They're the temple drama, but they're all mixed up and turned around.
Yes.
And I think they focus on this because of the overall thesis they have on the book of Psalms, which is about the temple. And
okay, let's be honest, everything in the scriptures is about the temple.
Absolutely.
Like
absolutely.
Chapter, the more you start seeing it, but keep going,
And so one of them is, I don't remember which psalm it is, but it comes up meek. All right, meek is used. And for them, anyways, they went through the Hebrew. They thought that meekness, it was also being applied to the Beatitudes. And they said, the meekness here is really I don't even want to call it submission, but maybe, but it is an agreement to follow covenants.
Yep. Yeah.
Right.
Your life is over. You're willing to do whatever the Lord asks, but that gives you power.
Yes. Well,
That's
you're anchored on truth.
Yeah.
You're anchored on truth and God. And so, yes, it gives you power.
Yes.
It's not again, it is submitting, but it's like saying,
it's the right
it's
kind
like
of submission.
Moroni in Ether 12, right? It's like, bring to me your weaknesses.
Yes.
And I will make them strength.
Yes.
It's like that.
Yes. It's Ammon getting up and saying, okay, we converted all these thousands of Lamites. Look what God did. It's not hiding from accomplishment. It's realizing, no, we can be proud of this. No, we are, Nephi, 1 Nephi 1:1, the famous verse that everyone's read a million times, right? He says, I was highly favored of the Lord. Well, what is the word favored? Favorite. He's basically saying, I'm one of God's favorites. Like, okay, like you want to like.
All right, Nephi, tell me more.
Right, but the way he's saying it is in a true way. He's saying, and Joseph Smith talks about this in Lectures on Faith, and of course, I mean, Lectures on Faith was compiled with multiple writers, but Joseph Smith influenced it, so that's why I'm going to say.
I was actually going to bring that up and ask you about that later.
Yes. There's multiple, but definitely Joseph Smith is the one like behind it. You got like Sidney Rigdon, others kind of like wordsmithing and things. But he says right in there, he's like, what gave the ancient saints confidence to go through hell, to go through being boiled in oil, lose all their kids, and just be like, do it, go for it. What gave them such confidence? And he was like, it's because they knew they were the favorites of heaven, because they knew they had done everything God had asked, and they knew what the reward they were going to have in the next life in the true sense, not in an arrogant sense.
No, that's hope. That is the hope.
That is what hope is. You're right.
And that's something that's hard to work. Still, I have a really hard time with it because I talk a lot about faith, hope, and charity.
Yes.
And if you look at that, it's very specific in the scriptures that hope is a future. It's your future state of being, essentially, given to you because of Christ.
Yes.
Right? Or the opportunity, because
it's God saying, yeah, you are going to be saved, or this is what you're going to inherit, or you are going to receive this reward, right?
But if you look at it wrongly, it looks like pride.
100%. Yep.
Right?
Yep. So it's those counterfeits. And I think Satan does that on purpose because he wants us to get so grossed out by the counterfeit, we won't seek the pure version. But yeah, if you look at all through the scriptures, like these are guys that are tough and they're strong. What's giving them that strength? Well, it's not because they were watching TED Talks and are like, okay, I'm going to go like dominate the earth. No, it's because they're talking to God. And so they know what they know. And at the same time, they'll give the shirt off their back to, I have a little bit of a side tangent, but it comes in and pulls everything, since we're talking about Joseph Smith's teachings. In the Joseph Smith translation, the Josephites. Mind if we go there for a second?
I love it. I've heard you talk about these things before. Okay,
because it ties into the whole responsibility factor. Like I brought my scriptures because I was like, I don't know where we're going to go. So we'll just go where the conversation kind of heads. But this is in the Joseph Smith translation of Genesis 48. And what we're going to see here is understanding how to take responsibility, how to receive blessings from God, but how that actually makes you a servant. So there's this humility and power, meekness, but they work together.
Well, Christ was a servant.
Yeah.
The servant.
Yeah. He lived his whole life, not really having a lot of fun and vacations. So in Genesis 48, if you just go read the Bible version, this is when Joseph brings his two children, Ephraim and Manasseh, to Jacob. They're being reconciled, this family together. And Jacob does something that I think in our culture we would say is a little funny or odd. He basically says, okay, Ephraim and Manasseh, I'm taking you. Like, you're not your dad's kids anymore. You're my kids. And that's what he does. He adopts them. And he says they will be called after my name. Therefore, they were called Israel. So that's why they're considered under the 12 tribes of Israel. And I don't completely understand all of the covenant reasons why he took Joseph's children as his. I feel like there's something there. I want to kind of like chew more on that, probably in the temple, kind of figure out what There's something going on here that's significant. But essentially that's what happens. But then Jacob turns to Joseph and is like, yeah, I just took your 2 kids. But he says, thy issue, this is in verse 6 of the Joseph Smith translation. Again, you got to read it in the Joseph Smith translation because that's where all the meat is. But he says, thy issue, so your children, which thou, Joseph of Egypt, begettest after them shall be thine. They will be called after the name of thy brethren. Therefore, they were called the tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim. So basically, he's saying, Joseph of Egypt, you're going to have more children, more sons, and we're going to kind of label them under the house of Israel. They'll be called Ephraimites, they'll be called Manasseites, but they're your children. And he keeps going. He says, okay, Joseph, you inherited all of these blessings. You're obtaining the land for an everlasting possession. He says, you saved my house from death. This is in verse 8. He says, you delivered all of your brethren from famine. He says, wherefore God will bless thee, and the fruit of thy loins, they shall be blessed above thy brethren and above thy father's house. In other words, these other Josephites, they're blessed above Judah, Levi, even Manasseh and Ephraim. Like there's these other kids. Now, and he says he says that, okay, verse 10, he says, thy brethren shall bow down unto thee from generation to generation unto the fruit of thy loins forever. So if you just read right there, you're going to be like, okay, wait, who are these elitist kids and what's going on here, right? Because that's the same response Joseph's brothers had, right? Where Joseph goes to them and he's like, I had this dream, and the sun and the moon and all the stars bowed down to me. My dad bowed down to me, my mom bowed down to me, and all my siblings. And they're like, okay, you arrogant get out of here. That's what they did. Tried to kill him. So Jacob's saying, yeah, no, that dream was legit, and it's not just about you, Joseph, but all of your children. Why are these children being given this position of power? Well, in the next verse it says, because they will be a light to my people, to the house of Israel, to deliver them in the days of their captivity from bondage, to bring salvation unto them when they are altogether bowed down under sin. And then he goes on and he starts talking about Joseph Smith and Joseph Smith's responsibility to save Israel and all of this. What I love about that passage is you're seeing this balance of, Joseph of Egypt has to go through a lot of hell to get these blessings. It's not like he just woke up one morning and it's like, oh, you're just a special kid, I'm going to give you this. No, he goes through 14 years, right? If you count all of slavery between Potiphar and then he's in Pharaoh's prison. 14 years of misery. It's like really hard. Then he has to go and do all this work to go save the family that never appreciated him in the first place, and he doesn't get to see them. He never gets to see Benjamin, basically his beloved brother, his whole life. Benjamin doesn't get to see him. Like there's a lot of sacrifices that go involved. And so then the Lord's like, okay, through Jacob, you're going to be blessed and your children are going to be blessed. But the blessing is that you get to be a servant forever. That's the blessing, right? The blessing is, but that's not a demeaning thing. The more you become like God, I feel like the more you realize it's a privilege to be able to realize, okay, I have a blessing and I want to take that blessing to others. And this is what you see in Joseph Smith's life. He spent his whole life, it was a really hard life. But when you read Joseph Smith's teachings and you read the stories of people who knew him, he was so optimistic and cheerful. He was funny. He's laughing. He was not this guy walking around like, oh, like we are making all these sacrifices for the Lord. And we like, oh, like my life is so hard. Like he was just always like, this is great, and you're like, okay, you're being tarred and feathered. You're losing all your kids. You never get to be home. Like, what's your problem, because he was realizing, wow, look at what we're building. He's creating, he's developing, he's helping all of these people. And I think that's the perspective that he and so many of these other prophets, like Abraham, I think, was probably the same kind of personality. All the Book of Mormon prophets, you read all of them, they're happy guys. They're guys that you'd want to be around because they realize that joy that comes from the responsibility and the service and how exciting this is. Like we can help all these people develop and find joy. And yeah, it takes a lot of sacrifice, but that's love. And love conquers.
And love is responsibility. Right. So that goes right back to the same point. It's like, you're going to be blessed as a servant. which means you're going to serve, you're going to love others and God.
Yes.
And that's responsibility. It is a blessing, right? Responsibility is a blessing. You can call it a curse to some degree, but it's a blessing.
Yeah.
And I don't think that you can have joy without it.
No.
I mean, not real joy.
Not real joy.
How do you get joy without having a responsibility for someone else?
Yes. Yes. Joy comes through creation. It comes through organizing. It comes through responsibility is another word you're using for that. It's developing. And that's why I feel is why Joseph Smith's teachings are so important, because he grew to understand this through personal experience, through visions, through talking personally with angels, talking personally with Jesus Christ. So he had just a whole different perspective. Like he told the saints, he said, if I haven't told you, he said, less than half of 1% of what he knew. So people, like a lot of people study Joseph Smith's teachings tons, like Andrew Ehat, Truman Madsen, like others. And they're like, there's so much here. And Joseph Smith's like, yeah, that's less than half of 1% of what I know. Because he was like, you can't share more. I'm like, holy cow, what are all these other cats hiding in bags that are going to be let out one day, you know? But he saw this whole perspective. And my dad would always say, if you want to be great at something, you go to the greatest, you find the greatest expert you can find to achieve it. If you want to be the best pianist in the world, you're not going to go to your neighbor down the street. You're going to go to the best pianist you can find. If you want to be a really good speaker, don't check in at your local high school speech and debate class. Go to the best ones out there. So if we really actually want to build Zion, and if we really actually want to be happy and become like God, we got to go to the people who knew it the best. And it kind of takes a step of faith. Like you're not going to understand it at first, but like I didn't fully understand what all the value was. Just make the effort. Go start digging in.
All right. So I've got to ask, who are these other Josephites then?
This is such a good question, right? I personally think that when we get the brass plates, there's going to be a lot of that history.
About that.
Because if you think about it, Laban is a descendant of Joseph, and he's keeping the records of his fathers. But it's not just, we know Isaiah's on there. We know there's a lot of Jewish writings on there. So it almost seems like the brass plates are kind of this record of maybe these fathers that are over all the fathers, kind of keeping the whole history together. And then you've got the Bible that's kind of like their version. And then you've got the Book of Mormon is the Nephite history, but you kind of have this overarching. That's what I suspect is on the brass plates. So when we come to today, I think kind of looking at the promises and asking who are fulfilling those promises. So for example, in verse 48, verse 11, when he says they're going to be a light, they're going to deliver Israel in the days of their captivity. Well, clearly that's physical and it's spiritual. So you start looking around and you start noticing, hey, we have all these presidents of the church that have devoted their entire lives to delivering people from spiritual captivity. Interesting. And you'll notice most of them are pretty patriotic freedom fighters too. Funny how those always go together. I would suspect like George Washington. I would suspect like these great men that have literally have done this, who killed themselves their whole life, made sacrifices, lost everything to do what? To help those around them to a better life. I do believe it's tied into the temple, because what do we covenant to do in the temple? Sacrifice, consecration, obedience, the law of the gospel. Why? So that we can help our children and those around us build Zion, build the kingdom of God. So yeah, I don't know. I don't have like a quote right here and something like, but I think if you start looking at the promises, and I think every single one of us can ask ourselves too, like, do I resonate with this? Do I feel like this is like, honestly, when I read that passage, I'm like, this is me. That puts in words like what I'm feeling. Like, okay, you know, you always want to find people or music or books that get you, that get how you think. And when I read that, I'm like, okay, this is what I'm thinking, that sometimes I think is so weird. Okay, that's the goal. Yes. And I want to be with people like that. I want to sit down at the table with a bunch of men and women that are all talking about this. That's my ideal Thanksgiving.
Well, it's interesting because it goes through and talks about how, you know, everyone's going to bow down to Joseph and that might be all of us to a certain degree.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's...
If you're a king and a queen in the house of Israel, that's kind of a...
Yeah. It's like, that the whole thing you're talking about is this tradition of Joseph that I think is brought through the brass plates, and then, of course, to the Book of Mormon. I don't think we really understand the legacy of Joseph, right? And what he means to us today.
Yes.
Right? And maybe who some of us are, right? And how we have the Book of Mormon and what that means. Why you follow this entire DNA coming through from Joseph all the way down through the Book of Mormon to Joseph Smith, Moroni to Joseph Smith, and then out to the Ephraimite Gentiles, so to speak.
Yes. No, 100% right. Like when Captain Moroni gets up to the Nephites and he says, we are a remnant of Joseph. He doesn't even get up and he doesn't say, oh, we're Manasseites or we're Ephraimites or we're Judah. Like he says, we're a remnant of Joseph. I think he's trying to remind them, who are you guys? And I think probably the most important thing we need today is identity. I think everyone, including myself, is starving to know our identity. We want to know who we were in the premortal life. We want to know who we are now. What are we doing here? What is going on this planet Earth? Like, what are we doing here? Why are things set up this way? And that's where, I'm sitting here looking at the Joseph Smith translation, and you look at it, what is Joseph Smith revealing through the whole thing? Covenants, identity. He's trying to tell us. And why did he need us to know that? Because not to be like, oh, some guy 600 years ago, this applies to him, but to sit there and read this and go, okay, wait, this is me. This is why I'm here. This is why my life is hard. I'm going to push through. Okay, here's the promises. Here's how to do it. And that goes again back to Moroni sitting there saying, Joseph Smith, the whole purpose of the Book of Mormon, this whole purpose of this whole restoration thing is let's get the kids back to the dads. Let's help them realize who they are so that they can actually bear off the kingdom, take it to the next level.
Yeah. All right. So back to Joseph Smith. How radical are his teachings in his time?
I think they're still really radical today.
They are, yes.
What made Joseph Smith so radical is that he made the gospel so literal. And what I mean by that is he would read the Old Testament and he'd be like, okay, let's be like Abraham. Let's go do this. Let's be like, they didn't really know much about Enoch, but, once he learns about Enoch, he's like, oh, we can do this too. Let's go build Zion ourselves, King David, he reads this. He's like, well, we'll go set up our own Nauvoo Legion. We'll go set up our military. What's the role of and school? And that's where he gets into the whole polygamy. You can't understand Joseph Smith unless you understand the Old Testament and the New Testament. Because all he's doing is he's saying, guys, what they did was smart. We're going to go back and recreate that, but we're going to do it even better. Now, when I say they, I don't mean the apostate state of Israel, like most of the scriptures is people struggling. But I'm talking about the men that actually achieved it, that got it. The Abraham, the Isaacs, the Jacobs, the Seths, the Adams. And Joseph Smith is just saying, let's take this as literal. So when you're talking to your evangelical friends and you're like, oh, you guys don't believe in the Bible. Actually, we believe in the Bible more than the others. We just take it really literal. And then on some things, it's more metaphorical.
Yes.
I'm not getting into the whole debate right there on how to interpret scripture, but in terms of, no, you can talk to God. God is real. He has a body, and you can talk to him. You can become like him. These angels are real. They're not. It's not just this emotional, intangible essence. It's not the force, right? It's not the force. These are actually real people. And he's like, Moroni's alive. He's talking to me. He can talk to you too. Let's go build this. Let's go build this city. Let's build something better for our children. Let's figure out what good hospitals look like. How do you eat right? It's just and that threatens Satan because all of a sudden it's real. Satan doesn't care if we just sit around reading our scriptures all day. He doesn't care. He cares when we actually start going and living those scriptures, right? That's when he's like, oh, no, let's not do this. People don't care so much about your beliefs until it actually becomes practical till you're actually going and building, right? It's when the saints actually are moving to Missouri and are like, yeah, this is Zion and we're building it. That's when they're like, okay, you guys are done. We're done with you guys. But if we don't have something real, it's like if you only have an inheritance, a land inheritance in your mind, what good is that?
Right. Know? Some nebulous promised land. Yeah. So again, then that brings me back to looking at his teachings. Why aren't we looking at them more? I mean, why don't we pull from this more? There is, I mean, and this is, I'm the worst offender here on this, but I've been through probably the teachings of the Prophet Joseph probably 3 times, I would say. Maybe 3 times I've gone through the whole thing, but it's probably been 15 years since I've looked through it. Why?
I'm not judging you. Trust me, I've got to do so much better myself.
So why are we not pulling? Because it just seems to me, especially as you're talking about this, that we can get so much more clarity and reality on everything if we would read what he says.
Right now, and it's sitting right there for us.
Yeah. Okay. Exaltation. This to me is kind of like the mother lode of everything that he talks about. It's like, because it involves everything. It involves our identity. It involves what is the council in heaven all about. It involves purpose, why you're here, why you're getting a body. But it is such a radical teaching. And it's one of those other things. It's like going back to that whole idea of, well, you're exalting yourself. You're being proud, right? If you're teaching something like this, that's what I usually have in the interfaith discussions. How can you possibly believe that you would become like God?
Yeah,
right. That is a heresy. It is unbelievably proud, but man, it's beautiful.
Yeah, I think they're missing what God is doing up there. Because again, it's this whole theology of, oh, God is this king and he's so he's God, right? And he's on this top of a topless throne and he's a force, right? He doesn't even have a body. And we're just all created to sit there and praise him day and night, right? Like that's all we do. We're with our harps and up there singing, and they're missing that God is a man who wants to create and wants to develop and wants to build cities and music. This is again what Joseph Smith is coming. He's saying he's a person. He's a musician. He's an artist. He loves to tell a good joke. He's a person. He loves to explore a scientific question. He loves to build things. He would be the dad out there building the best playground in the world and just watching and getting tickled pink like his kids just having the time of their lives, right? He's a person. He's real. He enjoys the best cooked meals. Like he'd be the best chef out there. He'd be the best artist. And he knows that joy comes by helping all these other intelligences be able to discover joy themselves. This is, I'm not a parent myself, but I can only imagine with my siblings. And so you can speak to this even better. Like as a parent, you just want your kids to find what you've found and be happy and just be growing together. And so what they don't understand is that's what it means to become God. So you're just trying to, you want to keep that cycle going. You want to have children and you want to help them grow and you want to create. And it's really just fully developing who you are as a human, as an intelligence, and doing that forever in ways we can't even comprehend. It's very beautiful. There's purpose.
It goes to what you're saying about being real. It makes God real.
Real, very real.
It really does, because it's if he is us in a sense. How do you get more real than that?
Yes.
Right? It takes away the divide. One thing I talk about a lot about is this whole idea of participation versus observance. And most of Christianity is an observance.
Yes.
There's this massive gap.
That is what Satan loves.
Yeah, there's this massive gap between us and God, and it's always there, and it'll never change. And we don't believe that. That's not how it works. We are part of the plan. We were part of the plan. We have input. We have roles and jobs and responsibilities and everything to help with the plan, because we need to be like him, right?
And we even need to become more engaged. I feel like, when you're asking, well, why don't we study Joseph Smith's teachings more? I think in a lot of ways we're asleep, which if you go read the parable of the 10 virgins, how many of the virgins are asleep? Wise and the foolish. a lot of people are like, oh, the 5 unwise.
No, it's all of them.
All of them. All of them are asleep. Okay, that's all of us. And Heber C. Kimball actually made a prophecy where he said all of Joseph Smith's boys right now are asleep. He was like, but one day they're going to wake up and then they're going to roar like the thunders of Mount Sinai, and they're going to go just take the gospel to the earth. And I feel like in a lot of ways, we're asleep. I was asleep. I still am asleep in a lot. Like we're just, when someone's asleep, they just don't realize what's going on around them. And but once they wake up, they realize, wait a minute, what am I sitting around for? Like, whoa, let's go do this. And I think Satan tries to make the gospel seem like it's complicated and like, oh, well, I've got to go like listen to all these 100 hours of podcasts and I've got to go read all these books to get it. And I just don't have the brains for it. Instead of realizing like Joseph Smith is a 14-year-old boy who walks into the grove of trees with a question. And by that night, he knew more about the kingdom of God than every single one of us put together. Like this is actually really simple. I'm not saying it doesn't require hard work and sacrifice, but it's actually really simple. Just start studying and realizing the answers are there. And I think if we approach the gospel thinking, okay, God, I want to know how to parent. I want to build Zion and I want to build it now. And I don't want to sit around waiting for 100. Like, again, if you read Joseph Smith talks about, he's like, there's going to be wicked alive on the earth during the millennium. He starts talking about, he's like, Joseph Smith will be there, not Joseph Smith, Jesus Christ will be there part of the time, but he'll also be gone a lot of the time, but he'll be visiting. He just talks about all this stuff. And I remember when I was reading these quotes, I was like, wait, this is a different perspective of the millennium and the second coming than kind of the oversimplified story. But all of a sudden it started making it real. So Joseph Smith started talking about, like, if we're going to do this, we got to have the physical kingdom of God. That's why he's in Nauvoo and he's setting up, when he's ordaining men as kings, that's not just some cute little name. He's saying, no, Lyman Wyatt, I want you to go to Texas and I want you to go build a city. Now, we weren't righteous enough at the time to do it. So that's why that got pulled back. And it's like, okay, everybody, like, let's just, all we can handle right now is just trying to behave ourselves. And that's kind of where we're at now. But at some point we need to start moving. And that's going to come from the people. That's going to come from all of us waking up and taking this seriously. And if you read D&C 21, which is the charter that the Lord gives to the church, kind of like, okay, guys, here's your mission statement. Go. He says right in there, he says, give heed to all Joseph Smith's words and his commandments. So not just the things he says, oh, I need you to do this, but just his advice. Like, it's like, listen to him. He's smart. He knows what he's talking about.
And doctrine even, right?
Yes.
Okay, so let's finish with this. He has all of these teachings. Who is Joseph Smith, right? In terms of, I mean, I don't want to go there. Okay, you have like those personality tests, right? With all the colors or the INTJs or whatever they are. I'm not going to ask you specifically what he is there, but who is he? I mean, because what is his profile as far as the type of person that he is? And do you think that, I mean, we believe that we are all someone already when we are born because of our premortal experience.
Yeah.
But how much does the restoration maybe change him? And how, maybe if you looked at his natural personality and the role that he has to play, what do we get when we pull those together?
Okay, this is such a good question. So there's so much loaded. There's so much loaded. So one of my favorite books is They Knew the Prophet. And I talk about it ad nauseum because it's a compilation of people who knew Joseph Smith personally and their stories. No commentary. So you literally just get firsthand. It's not filtered through anyone or historian or anything. And when you start studying those stories, you start realizing, holy cow, this was not just a brilliant prophet, like theological thinker. This guy was, I've never met anyone their equal in terms of charity, compassion, wisdom, discipline, being able to judge fairly, humor, at the same time, like, strong. He's a wrestler. Like, there's a reason why sometimes we're given a bad rap of like, you got Joseph Smith like on this pedestal. Like, you just make him seem like he's just like perfect. I'm sorry. He pretty much almost was perfect. Now, that's really controversial to say because we're in this day and age where we have historians galore that are just trying to tear him down.
It's like their primary purpose.
And I'm not saying he was the Son of God, because he wasn't. And he made mistakes, but he didn't make the kind of mistakes that you and I make. Mm-hmm. He's on a whole different level. And I will stand by that. I'll stand by that testimony before Jesus Christ one day. We have a compilation on our website, on our LDS Answers website, and it's the title of the post is Latter-day Prophets Testify of Joseph Smith's Greatness. And it's every president of the church, what they said about Joseph Smith. So it's pretty long. Mm-hmm. You start realizing, like, multiple were their testimony. They said no greater prophet has ever lived except for Jesus Christ than Joseph Smith in his character. We're not just talking about his mission or what mm-hmm. he did, but actually who he was. And I feel like for the last 100 years, we've seen this whole movement of revisionist history where we've seen it with the American founders. We've seen it where there's this attempt to destroy an ideology or to destroy an idea. You attack the character of the person. Now, there is a level where you got to be careful with that, where you got to sometimes separate the two, but there is merit to the argument that if someone is not a righteous person, you shouldn't really give a whole lot of credence to what they say. Mm-hmm. This is what Moroni says, right? In, I think it's Moroni 7. He says, a bitter fountain cannot bring forth pure water. He says, and a pure fountain can't bring forth bitter water. He says, so the source does influence the message. Again, why? Because every single one of us sees the world around us based on who we are. You know, if I'm naturally kind of more of a stingy, judgmental person, I'm not going to be able to share and accurately judge things right. If I don't transcend my culture, I'm not going to be able to give you good theology and good ideology. You're going to have to be careful and sift through it. So yes, Joseph Smith's character matters. Who he was matters 100%. And that is why I think right now there's a huge effort to be like, Joseph Smith was not that very great of a person. He's got all these weaknesses and failings and flaws. And I feel like we're in a situation where we've got 2-year-olds questioning the parents about things they have no idea what they're talking about. You know, when the 2-year-old is screaming and how dare you hate me? Like, you know, and in a situation where the parents just literally just trying to be loving and be like, don't run into the street. Like, mm-hmm. you cannot run into the street. You have to. My mom is so mean, mama. And you're just like, you just don't know what you're talking about. Like, one day when you're 50 years old, you'll understand why I'm not giving you Twinkies all day long and just letting you run into the street, or why you have to take a bath at night. Like, there's just a reason why you can't understand it. And I feel like we have a lot of pygmies questioning a giant, and it's just, you can't. Boyd K. Packer said it well. He said, you cannot write prophetic history unless you have the gift of prophecy. In other words, if you want to understand Joseph Smith, you're going to need to be able to have some of the gifts that he had. Unless you've had visions, you can't judge or understand someone who has had visions. You can't. Now, none of us are Joseph Smith, so to some degree, none of us can fully comprehend him. But someone like a Joseph Fielding Smith or someone like that, they're going to understand Joseph Smith on a whole nother level mm-hmm. that someone that has never talked to God before in their life doesn't have a clue. Because otherwise, Joseph Smith does look like a nutcase in a lot of ways. And he's making these claims, and you're like, where in the world are you getting this? To that degree, that's an extreme example. But to that degree, every single one of us are going to understand Joseph Smith to the degree that we walk in his steps. If you actually have wrestled with God, you're going to understand all of a sudden what's going on a little bit better when he's wrestling in Liberty Jail. If you've actually had an endowment experience, all of a sudden you're going to understand what's going on a whole different way. So that's one of the reasons why sometimes I get a rap for being a little bit of a stickler on Joseph Smith's character, but it matters. And I think one day every single one of us is going to stand before him and we're going to realize, yeah, he was incredible. He is incredible.
Well, on that note, we will end. I really appreciate your time and your insights. I'm inspired more. What is the book here again?
Yeah, Encyclopedia of Joseph Smith's Teachings.
Okay. Encyclopedia of Joseph Smith's Teachings. I'm going to go grab that and start reading these things a little bit more. So thanks so much for your time and your responsibility in learning all these things and sharing it with us. Really appreciate it.